Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp, and I have with me Dr. Jerry Bergman, who is one of my favorite people. I think I met you sometime at a Creation Research Society conference around 1977.
Probably around that, yes.
And I think at that time you had one book. It was what was it called?
The Vestigial Organs book.
Yeah, we had that one, and they had another one, The Criterion.
Criterion, yep.
And you were talking a little bit about your experiences with academia and how there was some problems that you encountered when you were a teacher going into college, and you have a very interesting past. Why don't you give us a little bit of that?
Yeah, I was teaching at Bowling Green State University then, and I discovered that academia is not too supportive of the idea that we were created, that the common belief was that we evolved from monkeys. Mm-hmm. Actually, they don't say monkeys, they say us and monkeys evolved from a common ancestor.
Right.
But that common ancestor was a monkey. Mm-hmm. And they have no idea what that common ancestor actually was. It just must have been a monkey a long time ago. And I had a number of problems with that. I taught in the life science area as well as the psychology area, and I had a number of concerns about that, and they didn't appreciate that. Actually, what happened was I wrote a monograph for Phi Delta Kappa, mm-hmm. and the monograph, by the way, was one of the best-selling in the series, and basically I talked about why we need to look at, as you might say, both sides of this issue. Try to objectively talk about the whole creation issue. Were we created by God, or did we evolve? And my colleagues at the university were upset, to say the least. You do not present any side except the evolutionary side. Evolution is true, it's factual, and that's the only side you should support. You should spend your time criticizing and evaluating negatively the other side. And I guess I never expected the hostility. As a student, of course I'm a paid customer basically as a student, mm-hmm. and 9 years of college, I never came across any opposition like I experienced as a faculty member. But of course, it's a different world to be a faculty member than it is to be a student.
And it's certainly like what I experienced at Michigan State University, because I remember there was a professor that I had there. Actually, learned about him before I graduated. His name was Dr. John Moore.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And he taught the creation side along with an evolutionist who taught the evolution side in a natural science course. And I think at the time the creation science was so new that it was sort of treated by the people there as a curiosity, and there didn't seem to be much of a hostility towards it at that time that I can remember. But I know that he experienced a lot of pressure to retire later in his career, and I think that was a lot of the things that caused him to do that. But you've written quite a number of books, 60 books.
60 books, right?
And we've been working on one of your latest ones called "Canceled 3 Times," is a book about your life.
Yeah.
And it's talking a lot about your particular way of dealing with these particular issues in academia. And the 3 times actually were the 3 different universities that you worked at.
And ironically, I came out of atheism, but of course that upset them. And you're right, earlier you mentioned, in the 50s, the 40s, there was not that much hostility mm-hmm. against those who critique Darwinism, evolution. And so therefore it's gotten more hostile as time went on. I'm not sure why, but I think the success to some degrees of the creation movement has allowed them to become more aggressive because they felt that, well, it's growing, and therefore it's a threat, and therefore we need to do what we can to stop it. And therefore there has been a lot of hostility. But I went into atheism partially because my father was an atheist, so that influenced me. And also at the universities I taught at, many of the faculty were atheists. Now, they weren't aggressive atheists. They were what I call functional atheists. They lived their life as if there was no God. And that doesn't mean they're going to go out and go on TV and talk about atheism. Most of them did not. So they were not openly proselytizing for atheism, at least openly. But they indeed, this was their worldview. This came out in their lectures, their teaching, their writing, and so on. And so therefore I call them functional atheists. So most of my colleagues were functional atheists. And of course you're influenced by the environment around you. And I was, as most students were, and as most faculty are, I was influenced by my environment. And I accepted the atheist worldview, not for very long, but that was part of my worldview. And eventually I became very disillusioned with atheism, and eventually I left atheism, and I could go into detail as to why, but I did, I should say, have good relationships with my atheist friends. In fact, I worked for Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who is probably the most controversial atheist in America. She would brag that she was the most hated woman in America. And she was very controversial because, well, she was, I hate to say it this way, but she had quite a mouth on her. She was very bright, very articulate, and she could use her articulateness to really condemn those she didn't like. And that was especially the Catholic Church, as well as Protestants and Christianity. And I remember she liked all my articles I wrote. I wrote for her magazine, American Atheist, and it didn't take long where I realized the flaws of the atheist worldview, and eventually I did leave and, of course, became a Christian, as so many have. I've noticed, by the way, a lot of really gung-ho, enthusiastic Christians came out of atheism. It's surprising when I go and speak. I have a number of people say, oh, I was an atheist as well. So there's quite a fellowship among ex-atheists who became Christians, which I find interesting. And it's kind of like we're friends of the past.
Now, a question I might ask is, can you name one thing, one or two things that may have triggered your decision to abandon atheism?
Well, one thing which was important was the idea of human evolution. They, of course, believe in evolution of everything. The stars, all life evolved. And, of course, our concern is human evolution. And they believe that humans evolved as well from a primordial organism of some type. And as I did more and more study, I taught biology for many years. My background is in biology and science. And so as I learned more and more about the cell, for example, the mitochondria, how it works, the Golgi complex, and the cell is such well designed that I could see no way that this could ever evolve. And so my questioning evolution, I ended up with a response almost like you would expect to find from the stereotypical religious fanatic, that they became angry at what I was doing. And this did not push me back into the atheist movement, but it forced me out of it. I wondered, why in the world are these people so aggressive? Why do they get so upset? What difference does it make if I believe in God or don't? What difference does it make to them? Well, it made a lot of difference because this was their worldview, and this was, from their standpoint, an emotional issue, and I was just amazed at the vitriolism against me as a result of my rejection of the evolutionary worldview. And I found this is not uncommon. This is why I wrote 4 books, including The Criterion, the one, Doug, you mentioned earlier. And that was the first book I wrote, and I wrote 4 books since then, which basically talks about the enormous hostility atheists have for Christianity in general and creationism in specifically. And therefore, this really caused me to wonder, why are these people so upset? Why are these people so emotional? I mean, if there's no God, we live, we're born, we die, and that's it. Why do they get so emotional? Why are they so angry? And of course, the reason is because this is how they see the world. This is their worldview. And I had one atheist tell me, if you're right, there's a God, there's a heaven, and there's a hell, I'm probably not going to be in the best place when I die. And they didn't want to think about that. And the way they dealt with that is basically to reject the Christian worldview and accept the evolution worldview, which basically says, again, we're born, we live, we die, and that's it. There's no afterlife. There's no long-term purpose in life. Short-term purposes, I'm hungry, let's have lunch. That's a short-term purpose, but long-term purpose did not exist among them, and therefore it's pretty obvious that what I was saying, I think, made sense to them, and therefore they responded emotionally to try to condemn what I was saying or to try to quiet what I was saying, to try to argue against it. And the arguments against it were not often very rational. And that bothered me, because we're supposed to be rational people. We're supposed to look at the evidence, especially in the science area. Why not look at the evidence? And it was very clear they did not want to do that.
Now, I also know that it's a little bit of a journey going from atheism to Christianity. And you actually had rejected a form of religion before becoming an atheist. Tell us a little bit
Right,
about
I did.
those.
When I was young, my mother, not my father was an atheist, but my mother became involved in the Jehovah's Witnesses. And that affected me, of course. I spent some time going to meetings and learning about the worldview of them. And a lot of people don't know this about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but they were really very aggressive on the creation issue. We had studies, sermons, books, showing indeed that evolution is not true, it could not be true, and creation is true. Now, this affected me, but nonetheless, when you go to college, when you're surrounded by the atheist, or at least the evolutionist worldview, you're affected by it. And so I had that background there, and therefore that background allowed me to criticize the atheist worldview, and eventually, of course, rejected it. I just wonder, if I didn't have that background, if I would have left atheism and become a Christian. And I kind of today wonder, if I had no creationist background, no science background, would I have succumbed and been part of the atheist movement for the rest of my life? I don't know. My dad was. He was raised a Lutheran when he was younger. He became an atheist, again, going to college. And he studied science, my dad did. He was involved in a number of scientific pursuits, engineering, and science in general, physics, chemistry. And he left the church and never came back. So I have to wonder, but for God, would there be me?
That's right. Yeah. It's a decision that everybody has to make, and I think it's sort of like the easy road socially to follow the atheist path. And I remember when I was doing science experiments, trying to do the origin of life experiments, learning the chemistry of life. That was where I encountered what you found, inconsistencies with the way that inconsistency with the way that science is working with the chemistry of life. I was trying to make amino acids combine together to form proteins. Mm-hmm. Well, to do that, you have to remove a water molecule. Well, I was putting electrical spark on glycine and alanine, and didn't do anything. Yeah. But with tryptophan and tyrosine, well, I got some results that were kind of interesting, and turned the solution of these amino acids turned brown, and I found out that what I was really doing was destroying these amino acids and creating the tar and other junk out of it, but it wasn't doing what I really wanted it to do, was to bring about the proteins of life. And as I began to study the complexity of what a protein does, in terms of having up to thousands of different links in this chain to fold up into a little ball that contorts and fits into different shapes, and that catalyzes reactions by bending molecules and putting them in the proper shape so it puts in the right place. You know, there's a lot of intelligence that goes into something like that.
Yeah.
And so I was confronted by that with my own experiments showing that the chemistry of life really is not conducive to be able to form it all by itself. It has to have a creator, and it's sort of like you need the DNA to make RNA. You make the RNA to form proteins. The proteins are needed to make the DNA. And the RNA and all these things are interdependent upon each other. And I said, that doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, I found the same thing when I present these issues to my colleagues. Their response is, well, figure it out. What do you mean figure it out? Well, we know that abiogenesis is true. We know life came from non-life. So figure it out. And you sit here and criticize it. You need to answer the question. The question is, how did non-life become life? And that's what you have to do. And you can sit here and criticize it. Anybody can criticize it. But the fact is, do you have a solution? Well, my solution is, of course, that life was produced by intelligence. And they, of course, didn't like that solution. And they said, well, that's not science. Science has to be naturalistic. It has to be molecules did it purely on their own. And therefore, you need to find out why. Over and over, it appeared to me that they became so emotional, and you discuss these things. I mean, abiogenesis, why can't you sit around and talk about the chemistry? They have a hard time doing that because they know where you're going and they don't like where you're going. And they just want not to think about it. And as time went on, I discovered more and more problems with evolution. I guess one simple one that I remember is that water is toxic to life, right? And oxygen is toxic to life. We're all aware of oxygen corrodes. It also corrodes, oxidizes the body. And therefore you need antioxidants to affect the problem, to deal with the problem that oxygen is corrosive. And water is also corrosive to life. Water is, as they say, the universal solvent. And therefore, how can you get life when you have oxygen in the early Earth, or at least it's theorized that you had some, oxygen and water? Yet they say that to get life, you have to have oxygen and water. Well, wait a minute. You have to have the stuff that destroys life. How can you create life with something that destroys life? Namely, oxygen and water. And in fact, they say water is the universal acid. Given enough time, water will break down anything. And of course, how does your body work? What is inside your cells? What is inside your stomach? Water is an important ingredient. Now, of course, you have hydrochloric acid in your stomach, which helps as well. But on the other hand, a major digestive ingredient is water. And without water, of course, we know life couldn't exist. We need water for life to exist, but yet water is corrosive to life. And they say, oh, Bergman, oh, come on, Bergman, just believe it, accept it. And more, it became obvious that evolution is a belief based on some evidence, but a lot of the problem of evolution is the evidence is at least deleterious, if not fatal, to the evolutionary worldview.
Now, your book, canceled 3 times, that was about your experiences, actually, the academic environment in 3 different cases where you worked for the colleges.
Right.
And it also tells you a little bit about your early history, about the involvement in Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right.
But that, I think, is an excellent book for somebody to pick up and so that they can understand what people face when they go to college. And especially if you are a Christian parent and you're going to send one of your children to a secular university, they need to be prepared for what they're going to experience.
Exactly.
Now, what would you say be the type of preparation a student would need today?
read, 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 and then read some more. You learn a lot in your classes, of course. A lot you learn from the textbooks that you buy for your courses. On the other hand, you're going to get one side in the textbooks and one side in your lectures. So to know and understand the other side, you need to read books that present the other side. So at least you're aware of the other side. And I find people that do that, students that do that, end up doing better in college because they've already read a lot, like I did. I already read a lot about the genetics, about DNA and RNA and mRNA and tRNA and so on. I already knew about a lot of those things. So when I studied in college, I realized that you have a problem here trying to prove life evolved from non-life when for life to exist, you have to have so many, many pieces. And they mention the pieces in the textbooks in college, but they don't mention the fact, which is obvious, you don't have life, you can't have life until you have a certain minimum number of pieces. And then, and only then, can you have life. And so read, read, read. And I have to admit, I wasn't the best reader in the world. But I learned if I read 2 or 3 pages every day, I could get through a lot of books and learn a lot. And the more I learned, the easier it was to read in any book, because I had a better background, I had a foundation to lay the ideas on, and therefore read, read, read. So if you're aware of the other side, they call this inoculation. You need to be inoculated against the side that they're going to indoctrinate you in the universities. And that side, of course, is evolution. So therefore, you need at least to be aware of the other side. And when you are, then you can understand, well, wait a minute. This abiogenesis theory is a problematic because, and you'll know why it is wrong, and that will help you learn what you have to learn in college and help you do better. I find people who have a creationist background study these issues, and therefore they end up doing better in college than you'd expect. But on the other hand, you're probably not going to convert your professor. You're probably not going to convert many students. So just know what you can, know what you can do, and be tactful in talking to your friends, because probably most will be evolutionists and be aware of what's going on.
I remember one of the textbooks that I really enjoyed reading was my biochemistry textbook.
Oh, yeah.
It was Leninger.
Okay.
And I loved that book because it was so well laid out. You know, it had 2 columns where you'd have the pictures on the inside and the other column explaining what it is, and it was very, very well put together. But after, at that time, I had already became a creationist because I had already experimented with the chemistry of it, and so I knew this chemistry. But there is still the bias from the professors. It was showing up in that textbook, but I could also see through it because I could. The chemistry doesn't lie.
No, it doesn't.
And if you learn to distinguish what the facts are from the actual rhetoric that goes along with evolution, you can figure out what is truth and what is lie.
Yeah, a good point. It's a good point.
So your book, called Canceled 3 Times, will be just coming out. It'll be available on our website, raa.org. And you go to our shop page, it'll be available there, and it should be available soon. So we'll be advertising it soon. Still in the proof stage right now, so yeah. We'll have it available. So Jerry, what else can you tell us about that book?
Well, I did cover a lot of the experiences I had at Bowling Green State University. And I'll give you one example which really illustrates their antagonism toward one who did not accept their worldview. And that was during the meetings, they get together and have meetings about me. I wasn't allowed to be there. I didn't know what went on. And one of the faculty there pulled out my resume. And on my resume, it said I wrote a chapter of this book. And they had a copy of the book there, and they said, here's the book. You see, Bergman's chapter, there's no chapter in there. He's lying. He is claiming that a chapter was in there, and it's not there. And therefore, he's a liar. Now, I never knew about this until much later. When I found out about it, what they did was, my chapter was in the newer edition of the book. The one he had at the meeting was the older edition, which did not have my chapter. And so they were being deceptive in showing basically, well, it's not in here. And they should have asked me, if they're concerned about what's going on, they should have asked me. They say, wait a minute, you claim to have this chapter in this book. Here's the book. It's not in there. Could you explain? No problem. Here's the book. It's in the newer edition. A book edited by Calvert Dodge, by the way. Here's the newer edition. Here it is. So I wasn't being dishonest, but they didn't do that. To me, the ethical thing would have been to go to me and ask, what's the problem? And I could explain it to them. But I didn't know this issue was brought up, and therefore they got together and they claimed I was a liar. And of course, you could see why my faculty would accept that, because here Bergman makes his claim, and here's the book, chapter's not in there. And so therefore, this to me is grossly unethical, and this is one of the main issues I faced at Bowling Green State University. They were just grossly unethical, and this is a good example of what I faced. And so you realize, I guess you realize that as a student, I got along well with all my professors. But when you're on the other side, it's a whole different world. And that's what upset me, that I realized that this is the kind of people they are.
And if if somebody doesn't like you, they'll find all sorts of reasons for that dislike of you, and usually it's not something that's true. Usually it's a misunderstanding, but I remember even when I was in the military, there was quite a bit of that sort of thing I had to face and figure out how to do it. It helps when you're in a situation like that to find somebody of like-minded to pray with and to fellowship with.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because it's not something that's easy to do on your own.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That helped me a lot, especially when I was in the military, and I find this to be true no matter where I've worked. If I have a prayer partner that I fellowship with and meet on a regular basis, the whole job goes a lot better.
Yeah, and in Bowling Green, I didn't have that. One thing of interest is, many years later, I did a research on the internet and tried to find out where my colleagues are. And almost all of them had died, and none of them had a church funeral. All of them had public meetings or in the park. So none of them were involved in the church, as far as I could tell, and none of them had a church funeral. So that says a lot about where they were at when I was teaching at the university. So most of them were functional atheists. They live their life as if there is no God.
And probably met with an untimely death as well.
Yeah, well, one smoked pretty heavily. Back then you could do so, and yeah, he died of lung cancer quite early. He was in his 70s, I think, when he died, so... I outlived them all, as far as I know.
You outlived them all, and you're still thriving and doing well and happily married. So there's all that sort of benefit that you have of following Christ and being a Christian. And I hope that you enjoyed our little fellowship with Jerry Bergman today. He's a good friend of mine, and I really appreciate him. And we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.